So thanks for sticking it out here and being part of this last session. Today, this is going to be some food for thought for you to take away as you're getting ready to head home. We're going to talk about innovation. We're going to talk about 8 sources of innovation, some case studies based on research, and we're going to go from there. So hopefully this will be worth the wait. And when all of you come up with the innovative idea a couple of years from now, I'm going to say that it's because you were here. So first of all, I want to talk about these two terms, invention and innovation, because I think a lot of times we use them as synonyms. They're actually a little bit different. They're similar, but there's a difference. So an invention, a new thing, a new product, a new device. And innovation is also new. It's all of those things. It's new ideas, it's new practices. But the difference is that it is something that has been adopted into practice. So this is really a definition that is developed by Peter Denning, who you see on the screen here. He was a computer scientist, and he really became the father of the innovation process. So he really helped us understand that innovation is not just the lightning bolt that comes in the middle of the night. It actually takes time. So he based a lot of his ideas on the ideas of Peter Drucker, which we'll also talk about in a minute. I will say that I hate the word innovation. So this has been an interesting presentation that has developed over time. I think I'm very closely aligned with this quote. We've basically developed this cult around the term innovation. This author wrote for the Harvard Business Review, and when she published this article in 2020, there were 70,000 books on innovation for sale, which would take you 2,500 years to read. And I kept thinking, yeah, we have to get past this. And isn't there a way that we can incorporate research into some of the things that we're doing? So I'm a researcher, I'm an architect, I have an MBA, and I'm just trying to figure out, like, how do we actually pull all this stuff together? So of course I went on a search, and I came across Lars Holmquist. So he's from Sweden. He ended up in the Silicon Valley for a little bit, and he's back in academia in the UK. And he came up with this concept about grounded innovation. And his concept was you take invention, which is all about idea generation, and you combine inquiry by looking at studies and studying events, studying human interactions, and you come up with a balance of user-oriented design that creates that grounding in innovation or grounded innovation. So I thought, I can live with this. I like the concept that innovation can be grounded in something, and this is my interpretation as it relates to healthcare design. So we still have invention. We take all of the ideas that we have because we're architects and designers and owners who are interested in solving problems. We're also going to use our imagination. We're going to use intuition as part of that inventive process. In terms of inquiry, we're going to take a process of investigation. We're going to look at what the research says. We're going to use different forms of evidence. We're going to interpret all of that, which really aligns with the evidence-based design process that the center has advanced. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this all gets to that same context of grounded innovation. So how many of you are familiar with the EBD process? Okay, so I'm going to run through the 8 steps of the EBD process pretty quickly here. So this is akin to evidence-based medicine. So it's about using the best possible evidence. A lot of times it's research, rigorously conducted, credible research, to inform your decision making. So the first thing that you want to do is define the goals and objectives that you have for the project. So this goes beyond, meeting the bed count or, some of the CON types of goals and objectives, but really trying to understand what safety events are we trying to mitigate? What is that experience that we're trying to create? How can we do that through design? You're going to find the sources of relevant evidence for those goals that you have. You're going to critically interpret that to figure out whether it's appropriate for the project that you're working on. And from there, you can really start to create and innovate ideas. So I often say you have to know where the box is to get out of it. So that's really what this initial part of the EBD process is what do we know, and then how do we build from there? So ultimately, you can develop a hypothesis. What do I think my design intervention will do in terms of improved outcomes? You're going to collect that baseline measurement because if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. You're going to monitor during the design and construction to make sure that those things don't get taken out of the design during our infamous value engineering process. As Albert or Salvatore says, no value, no engineering in that. And then ultimately, we're going to measure the results. So really take that post-occupancy evaluation seriously and understand, did we actually get to what we hope to do? So I'm going to talk about Peter Drucker for a minute. So Peter Drucker is sort of the godfather of business management. And he wrote this book in 1986, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It is still a seminal work. And he was the one who really helped us understand that innovation is hard. It doesn't just happen. There's actually a systematic process. And this is where he and Denning actually played off of each other with some of the work that was happening to define this a little bit more. But he really helped us understand that there are actually sources of innovation. And if we're more aware about what those sources are, we have a better chance of actually innovating. So I'm going to run through some of these sources. I'm going to start by saying that there's also two types of innovation. One is disruptive innovation, and it gets accepted more quickly. I mean, the iPhone is probably a disruptive innovation. It's not just an invention, adopted very quickly. And then there's sustainable innovation, and this is more typical. And this is where it takes time, it's an evolution, and it's going to be building on one thing to the next to the next. So there's also internal sources of innovation and there's external sources of innovation. So the internal sources are the unexpected. So the unexpected is just that. You're planning on something and something else happens instead. How many of you are familiar with the origin of the Post-it note? Google it sometime. So the Post-it note was never envisioned as what we know it to be today. It was envisioned as something completely different, which failed. And the person who was looking at it found a new use for it, and now it has become the ubiquitous thing that we have in all of our offices. So this is an innovation that came out of an unexpected result. An incongruity. So this happens all of the time in the human factors world. We have this concept of work as imagined versus work as performed. If you describe how something is supposed to happen and then you watch how it actually happens, those two usually aren't the same. And this is often an opportunity for innovation to really try and address what needs to happen there. And that ties into the process need. So how many of you experience workarounds in healthcare? I expect all hands to go up there. So if you see a workaround, that is an opportunity for innovation. Something is not supporting that process, and design can support eliminating some of those workarounds. Industry and market structure change. So things happen within our regulatory environment, other conditions that we have to meet, that prompts us a lot of times necessarily into some type of innovation. We need to think about things a little bit differently. When we move into the external sources of innovation, we start to think about demographics. We heard about this yesterday. Starting to think about neurodiverse populations, starting to think about a population that is very specific to heroin use, thinking about our aging population. We need to start thinking differently about how we design for these demographics. Also look at changes in perception, mood, and meaning. So how many of you remember COVID-19? Did we change our perceptions about how things happened during COVID-19? Suddenly PPE became like gold. We needed to be very careful about how we were using PPE. We needed to think about, do we really need to go into that room or not? We're going to run cords outside of the room. We're going to create all of these things to manage a disease that has new meaning to us at this point, and we have different perceptions. New knowledge. So I consider this to be coming out of research, but it can come out of data that's internal to your organization. There are lots of ways that we can come up with new knowledge. This actually takes a longer time in the innovation process. There needs to be time to steep, time to get used to the concept a lot of times and make sure that it's actually something that becomes usable. And this is where it gets into that sustainable innovation, where maybe one idea builds on the next and then suddenly you have something that actually gains traction. And then the last is marginal practices. And this sounds demeaning. It's not. So marginal practices is when you're pulling things in from other industries and using them in new ways. So again, we heard about this yesterday, using the Ritz and their concept about what that hospitality experience needs to be and applying that into healthcare. I think you've probably all heard about the Disney philosophy at some point in healthcare, on stage, off stage. How does that carry on into the design of our healthcare facilities? And then even in terms of aviation, looking at the sterile cockpit, how do those concepts of standardization in aviation apply when we start looking at the design of healthcare facilities? So this is the framework that we're going to work in. This framework, again, came through Drucker and Denning and is really a great way to start identifying opportunities for where you might be thinking you need to be next. So I think a lot of times we think there isn't a lot of innovation happening in healthcare design. There's innovation happening in healthcare, but our facilities still look a lot the way they did 10, 15 years ago. And here's an opportunity to push the envelope a little bit by just recognizing where might my opportunities be. So the first case study I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do 3 research case studies. These are going to be very high level, very quick. And the first one is actually not about innovation. It is more about the concept of invention. So this is a study that is done by an Italian research team, the Spoladore team. And this is a project that's funded by the Italian government because they really want to be at the forefront of thinking about an aging population and specifically about technology with an aging population. So this initiative is called Age IT. And this team was looking at something pretty specific around waiting rooms. So why does this actually matter? So waiting influences the perceptions of care. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but there's been research on this that depending upon the aesthetics of your environment, your perceived waiting time can be lower, even if it's not. Once that happens, then your perceived quality of care goes up. It's this whole ripple effect of interactions that happen. A lot of times when we're looking at lean processes, we're trying to figure out how do we eliminate the waste of waiting, or how do we make waiting a productive part of the process? This team also looked at technology and said, you know, there's a lot of research around smart homes, but there's not a lot of research around smart hospitals or smart patient rooms, or specifically a smart waiting room. So what does that look like? What do we need to understand? And lastly, there's a lot of people that are really looking at what does this mean? What is the physical digital interface? And how do we use that going forward? How do we leverage technology in the built environment? And lastly, I'll just say I love this article because it's in a journal called Electronics. Like, how cool is that, that we're looking at built environment research that is in an electronics journal? So I'm going to quickly run through how this study was done. This was a systematic literature review. They went from 278 sources down to 16 papers. And for a systematic literature review, this is typical of how it works. You usually start with thousands and you get it down to a smaller number. They looked at 5 databases and they came up with 3 themes. And the first theme that they found in more than half the papers was about waiting enhancement. So they were really looking at some of these same concepts, like how do we make the waiting experience more productive? So is there technology that I can use to help educate the patient about their condition? Is there something that I can do to create a positive distraction so that it's not a completely lost process? I'm reducing the anxiety potentially. The second thing that they came up with was the collection of pre-visit data. So we just heard about healthables and wearables, and really understanding, you know, before you even get there, the physician may understand your blood pressure, may understand your blood glucose levels, may understand lots of different things about you. And then the last thing that they found, the theme that they found, was assessment and diagnosis. And this was really specific to very tailored patient populations and very specialty oriented settings. So they felt that even though there's some information here, it's not necessarily generalizable. So I should mention that because they're focusing on an aging population, one of their areas of interest is mental cognitive issues, and really trying to understand where does this go from the normal process of aging, potentially heading into Alzheimer's. That is a very difficult process to follow, and physicians really struggle with this. So they were trying to figure out how can we actually look at mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and figure out, you know, how can we start to anticipate this? So they took a different route than most systematic reviews. Most systematic reviews are going to take all that information, summarize it for you, and sort of end up with those 3 themes. Those 3 themes didn't really have to do with the built environment. So you're saying, why are you telling me about this study? This doesn't have to do with the built environment. That's what they said too. They said, hey, nobody's talking about the built environment. Let's make a proposal. let's make a proposal that uses all of these things that we learned about that integrate the electronic health record, AI, virtual reality, and create something different that happens in that built environment waiting room. So they came up with this concept of how a waiting room could be used to predict health conditions. And they felt that the first thing that's going to happen is the patient is going to come in with their companion, their caregiver, and they will be put into a VR environment. They're going to become familiar with that environment, just get used to what it's like being in that VR space. Then there's going to be an encoding process, and this is going to use gaming, and clinicians are going to be able to use this information to figure out a baseline set of measures associated with this patient that can then be tracked over time. So during encoding, you can say have a game about memory and say your goal is to find this set of objects and put them over here. So you're going to complete that task. You're going to do that as a game. It gives the physicians the opportunity not only to track your memory, but also to look at different biomarkers, whether it's your hand movement or your head movement or your walking gait as you're trying to find these different items. Then you're going to get out of that VR environment. You're going to forget what you just did. That'll be about 10 minutes. And then you're going to go back in. And if what you did was to find these objects and put them over here, your recall is going to be take these objects and put them back where you found them. So again, you're creating this baseline data that can get integrated into the electronic health record and can be using AI to start to track what are the differences, where do I start to see this patient moving into a different dimension. So this is a pretty cool concept. The challenge is it's not real yet, so it's not an innovation. But if we're looking at this, think about the 1968 movie 2001. I'm sorry, Dave, I can't open the pod doors. Hal, let me in. Didn't we think that was crazy at the time? It's not now. I mean, we have ChatGPT, we have Siri, we have Alexa, we have all of these things. So to me, this is an invention idea that may be an innovation at some point, and it just might be worth the wait. So the second case study I want to talk about is about simulation. And this gets into what I mentioned before, work as imagined versus work as done. And this is actually looking at two different concepts of sources of innovation because they're not always mutually exclusive. This is about an incongruity. So again, the way we think we do things isn't the way we always actually do them. And then pulling simulation as something coming from a different industry and applying it to healthcare design. So this particular team is out of the Children's Hospital of Atlanta. Nora Coleman has been leading this initiative for a while. They have this $1.5 billion children's hospital that they just opened. And this was part of the process that they went through during the design of their facility. So again, why does this study matter? So simulation has been used in clinical training for quite a bit of time now. And the whole issue is safety first. Like practice first and then do it on a live person after you actually have that experience of practicing through simulation. It has only more recently been applied into the healthcare design process, and it has gained adoption and traction at this point. So I do truly consider this to be an innovation of marginal practice. We all know that healthcare is complex, and design has to address these issues of complexity, but you can't see that in a two-dimensional plan. You can't see that in virtual reality or a Reddit fly-through of the facility. You need to see people interacting in that room to understand what is actually happening. But show me the money on this. How does this actually work financially? So in 2004, there was an article that was published about the business case for better buildings that was about the Fable Hospital. And it really looked at all of these different design interventions based on some projects that had been completed, the improved outcomes that they had. They started to look at, through a series of assumptions, what is that return on investment? What is the payback period for incorporating all of these evidence-based design components into a facility? And they came up with between 1 and 3 years. They updated the study in 2011, were more conservative, so it went from 1 year to 3 years. Still a pretty good payback period. 20 years later, this study actually starts to look at that business case in a slightly different perspective to say, what if we move this process up front during the design, and how do we actually try to improve the outcomes as we're trying to think through what are the decisions that we're making both in schematic design and design development. So the team used a process that they've developed that's based on another set of processes that have been in place for close to 10 years now. So again, it's innovation because it's been adopted and is now being adjusted. Simulation-based hospital design testing. They used 883 staff members. They did 15 different clinical areas with 146 different scenarios in both schematic design and design development. They went through this process because they do clinical simulation on a regular basis. Their sim team led this. So they used a process that they always use, failure mode effect analysis. And they tried to look at what is the severity, how often is this going to happen, and let's give it a criticality score so we understand priorities of how we're looking at things. They used a structured debriefing method that they also used during this process. So summarize, anchor, facilitate, explore, elicit. Really just try and understand how are we gathering our observations with the perceptions of the people that actually just went through that simulation. And then finally looking at this cost analysis of the mock-up. So they looked at construction materials and labor. They looked at the cost of participation of all of these 883 hospital staff members. They did not take into account the simulation trainers because they are already embedded into the system, and that is a cost within the system already, so they didn't add that in. And then they looked at the cost of changes in design. So you find that a code button is in the wrong place. How much does it cost to move that code button? How many rooms is that code button in? Multiply that out and you start to generate what these costs might be. So what did they find during the process? 722 undesirable design conditions. Conditions that did not support the intended workflow of what was being simulated. 400 plus of those actually resulted in design changes. The others were addressed through process change. They determined that about 28% of these would have been cost prohibitive. That's over $1 million if it had actually gone through the design process and needed to be changed afterwards. So those infamous change orders that we don't want to see. The simulation was not cheap, $1.7 million. But I mentioned this is a $1.5 billion project, so it was 1/100th of the cost of the project. So they really wanted to make this investment and again, leverage the expertise that they already had. So what did they start to define? They found some themes that came up during this process. Issues around standardization, issues around efficiency, issues around visibility, and then the physical hazards in the environment. So you can see standardization, they estimated around $8.4 million, efficiency at about 2.3 million, hazards in the environment 1.5, visibility 1.4. So the physical hazards in the environment, those things that you can see, like I'm tripping over this thing on my way, those actually are a smaller component of what we need to address. There are all of these other issues that become part of the design process when you try and figure out how am I properly supporting that workflow. So in the end, they found close to $50 million of cost avoidance in the bed tower. So think about all of those repetitive rooms over and over and over again. You're making that mistake. $50 million in cost avoidance. And then in diagnostic and treatment, they found a little over 32 million. And a lot of this was associated with our MRI suites. So in the end, their total cost avoidance was about $91 million. And they feel that this was well worth it because who wants to spend $100 million after the fact to try and fix these problems if you even have the opportunity to fix it? So my takeaway from this study is talk is cheap. And actions speak louder than words. We all are in the process of using mock-ups at this point, whether it's an individual room, whether it's a patient room, whether it's a hybrid OR, whether you're doing cardboard cities as part of a lean process. The next time you do one, think about running a simulation in that space. Think about documenting it and really understand how you can use this process to advance design in a different way. Use the innovation of simulation-based hospital testing to move yourself forward. The last study I'm going to talk about is about an empath unit. How many of you are familiar with empath? Okay, a couple hands. So this is the emergency psychiatric assessment, treatment, and healing space. This was created and invented by Dr. Scott Zeller back in about 2014 when he was at the Alameda County Hospital in Oakland, California. And he started realizing that you have people that are coming in a mental behavioral health crisis and being put into the emergency department, which only creates more stress and anxiety, creates agitation. For any of you who have seen mental behavioral health areas within an emergency department, you know that they typically look a lot like, let's just say, a jail. I mean, it's stripped down, there is nothing there, you don't want anybody to harm themselves, so there is nothing in the room. Sometimes you actually have police that are there, or security guarding the person. There's usually some type of lockdown associated with it. And his concept was, what happens if I put a bunch of recliner chairs in the lobby? They're like, oh, you can't do that, the patients are going to go crazy. Well, guess what? They didn't. The change in the environment actually reduces the stress levels, and a lot of the people that are experiencing a mental health crisis don't need to be admitted into the hospital. They need another form of treatment to be able to get them back into a better space. And the empath unit is designed to be something that is under 24 hours. So he really started advancing this concept. There's more than 60 in the country right now. I think that number is actually low. It's in more than 30 states. Now, how do I know that this is an innovation and not just an invention aside from the numbers? There was this article in the New Yorker. You know you've made it when your work is not in a peer-reviewed journal or just a trade magazine, but you're in the New Yorker and this is a thing that people are talking about. So they have definitely gotten a lot of traction at this point. And there was a team at the University of Iowa that did an empath unit, and we're like, what are the financial implications of this? Does this actually work for us economically? And they used data to do a study around the economic evaluation, but then they did a follow-up study with the same data set to look at issues around hospital admissions, around suicidal ideation. So again, two studies that I'm going to sort of combine into one to talk about this innovation of an empath unit. So we've talked a little bit about it. We know that this is important because mental behavioral health patients in EDs are just creating stress in the system. People are left there for hours, days, sometimes weeks until they can get transferred into an appropriate facility because we have such a shortage of psychiatric beds in the country. Reimbursement system, we can talk about all that. It results in treatment delays. It results in a lot of people leaving without being seen. It results in an increased length of stay, and it creates staff stress and potentially safety issues for the staff as well. So these are definitely things that we want to try and address. And if we can address it through a design intervention that is an empath unit, why not? So how was this study done? This was a pre-post study. So they looked at some data for about 6 months before the empath unit opened, and then they looked at data again for 6 months after it opened. There was a 6-week washout period between the time that it opened and when they collected data post-occupancy. It was all adults who presented to the ED, and it was done in an academic medical center. So it was an 811-bed academic medical center with a 60,000 square foot ED, 35 rooms. They built a 2,900 square foot empath unit with 12 recliners, so able to serve 12 mental behavioral health patients in crisis. And looking at the numbers, it was more than 23,000 people in the pre-empath period and about the same number, more than 23,000 people in the post-empath period. The primary outcomes that they were looking at really had to do with increased revenue, specifically associated with the empath unit, lower rates of left without being seen, lower rates of leaving against medical advice, and lower rates of transfers. And then also looking at issues associated with boarding time, length of stay, disposition, and total revenue for the organization. So you can see the pre-empath numbers here, about 15% psychiatric patients, 86% about non-psych, about the same number post-empath, so you're dealing with a very similar patient population here. And what they found was that the boarding time after the empath unit was put into place for psychiatric patients went down by about 190 minutes. So pretty good change there. It went up about 20 minutes for non-psychiatric patients. You can start to look at what's happening there in terms of the types of care that people were maybe able to give non-psychiatric patients because the psychiatric patients had been put into the empath unit, allowing the clinicians to focus on what they needed to focus on rather than people in hallways. The length of stay was reduced by about 114 minutes for psychiatric patients and again increased slightly for the non-psychiatric patients. Left without being seen went down, leaving against medical advice went down, transfers went down, and all of this resulted in financial gains of about $405,000 annualized to $861,000, and they looked at a sensitivity analysis to give them a range up to $2 million. So suicides, suicidal patients, people experiencing suicidal ideation or attempts also went down after the empath unit. The psychiatric admissions rather went down, so more people being treated in a more effective way. Any admission rates also went down. The 30-day emergency department return rate went down, as did the 30-day mental behavioral health follow-up. So people were 60% more likely to get that follow-up that they needed after they had been in the empath unit. So my takeaway from this study is that healthcare capital projects have to make sense, but we need to look at both ROI and social ROI to make sure that they're working to do the right thing. So in the end, I just want to leave you with these thoughts. Evidence-based design can be a bridge between understanding what needs to happen from our cool ideas to actually taking it into practice. And it's a team sport. You can't do this on your own. This can't be in a silo. I think everybody's heard there's no I in team, but there are a lot of I's in innovation. So it takes imagination, intuition, ideas, information, investigation, insight, inquiry, intelligence, integration, interpretation, but most importantly, it requires investment. It takes time, it takes money. So I hope that all of you take this opportunity to recognize that you may have a source of innovation right in front of you and make that investment, and then hopefully publish, turn it into a research project. So I want to thank you all for your time, and certainly if you have questions, you can talk to me afterwards. Thank you.